June 1961. The mountains of northern Laos. 23-year-old Moa Thao walked for 3 days through dense jungle, his feet bleeding, his stomach empty, following a guide he'd never met to a place he'd never been. He was Hmong, a highland ethnic minority who had farmed these mountains for generations. He spoke no English. He had no military training. He didn't particularly care about communism or democracy or any of the ideological struggles tearing apart Southeast Asia in the early 1960s. But Moa Thao was about to become a soldier in America's secret army. When he finally reached the remote training base at Padong, exhausted and uncertain, 2 airplanes appeared overhead. They dropped wooden crates attached to parachutes. The crates split open when they hit the ground, revealing something Moa had never seen before: modern military rifles, ammunition, hand grenades, and 57mm recoilless cannons. Weapons so new to the Hmong people that they needed to learn not just how to fire them, but how to keep them clean, how to carry them, how to reload them under pressure. They had 3 days to learn, 3 days to transform from subsistence farmers into soldiers, 3 days before they would face an enemy that had been fighting for over a decade. This is the story of the Hmong secret army in Laos, 30,000 mountain fighters recruited by the CIA to fight a war that officially didn't exist. A war so classified that when American pilots were shot down over Laos, the United States government denied they were there. A war where entire villages of Hmong people were wiped out, where 10% of the entire Lao population died, where more bombs fell than in all of Europe during World War II. It's the story of how the CIA built an army from nothing, armed them with weapons they'd never seen, dropped them into battles they couldn't win, and then abandoned them when the war was lost. And it's the story of 50,000 Hmong refugees who fled to America, carrying with them the memory of a war their adopted country still won't fully acknowledge. In 1954, when the First Indochina War ended with France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam into North and South. But Vietnam wasn't the only former French colony in the region. Laos and Cambodia also gained independence, and the international community declared them neutral states, free from foreign military interference. It was a nice idea. It lasted about 5 years. Laos in the late 1950s was a patchwork of competing factions, each backed by different foreign powers. Prince Suvarnabhumi led a neutralist faction trying to keep Laos out of the Cold War. His half-brother, Prince Suphanuvong, led the Pathet Lao, communist forces aligned with North Vietnam. Their cousin, Prince Baun controlled a right-wing faction supported by the United States. 3 princes, 3 factions, 3 foreign backers. It was a recipe for disaster. In 1959, the right-wing faction began cracking down on the Pathet Lao, triggering a rural insurgency. By 1960, the country had collapsed into civil war. On December 4, 1960, a right-wing general named Phumi Nosavan launched a coup with American military assistance, capturing the capital of Vientiane after a 3-day artillery barrage. The neutralists and Pathet Lao evacuated with help from Soviet aircraft. But General Nosavan's Royal Lao Army was corrupt, poorly trained, and spectacularly incompetent. Within months, they were losing ground to the Pathet Lao and neutralist forces, especially in the strategically vital Plain of Jars, a flat area where road networks converged in the center of the country. President Dwight Eisenhower was more concerned about Laos than Vietnam at this point. He allowed covert CIA training of the Laotian army and poured in economic aid, more per capita than any other country receiving American assistance. But it wasn't working. The Royal Lao Army kept losing. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, he inherited the Laos problem. The CIA had just failed spectacularly with the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and Kennedy was skeptical of their abilities. But he also ruled out conventional military support for Laos. He didn't want American troops dying in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map, so the CIA expanded its program of covert training and resupply. To avoid violating the Geneva Accords, military personnel were officially redesignated as civilians. Pilots flew for Air America, the CIA's covert airline. Special forces operators became contractors. On paper, no American military was in Laos. In reality, the United States was building an army. But CIA operatives like Bill Lair quickly became frustrated with the Royal Lao Army. As one National Security Council staffer complained, "We discovered the Laosians were not Turks. They would not stand up and fight. The CIA needed different allies. They found them in the mountains. The Hmong are an ethnic minority who had lived in the mountains of Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and southern China for generations. Ethnically and culturally distinct from the lowland Lao, they spoke their own language, practiced their own traditions, and had their own social structures. They were subsistence farmers who grew rice and opium in the highlands, living in villages connected by mountain trails that lowlanders rarely traveled. To the lowland Lao, the Hmong were backward hill people. To neighboring Vietnam, they were primitives who needed to be civilized and controlled. The Hmong, for their part, were fiercely independent and suspicious of any government trying to tell them what to do. They weren't particularly interested in ideological struggles between communism and capitalism, but they were very interested in Vietnamese forces moving through their territory. Historical animosity between the Hmong and Vietnamese ran deep, and the prospect of North Vietnamese troops using Laos as a highway to South Vietnam alarmed Hmong leaders. The CIA identified Major General Vang Pao as their most reliable partner. He was the only Hmong commander in the Royal Lao Army, a rarity in a military dominated by lowland Lao. Vang Pao was ambitious, charismatic, and understood both Hmong culture and modern military tactics. Most importantly, he was willing to fight. In early 1961, the CIA began secretly training Hmong fighters. The first recruits, like Mo Thao, were given basic weapons training and sent into combat within days. It was a desperate gamble born of desperation. In June 1961, just weeks after the first Hmong recruits completed their 3-day crash course in modern warfare, the Pathet Lao, now supported by North Vietnamese troops, attacked the Hmong base at Padong. The battle was a disaster for the newly formed Hmong forces. They lost Padong and were forced to retreat deeper into the mountains. Mo Thao and the other survivors found themselves scattered, disorganized, and demoralized. Many had seen friends and family members killed in their first combat. The weapons they'd spent 3 days learning to use had proven insufficient against experienced Pathet Lao fighters backed by North Vietnamese advisors, but the CIA was impressed. Despite their lack of training and their catastrophic defeat, the Hmong had fought. They hadn't surrendered. They hadn't melted away into the jungle. They had stood and fought an enemy with superior numbers, better training, and more experience. The agency decided to expand the program. They set a new target: train 10,000 Hmong fighters for what they called the Army Clandestine, the secret army. The goal was to contain the Pathet Lao in the Plain of Jars and prevent North Vietnamese forces from using Laos as a supply route to South Vietnam. The Hmong established a new base at Long Tieng, hidden in a mountain valley accessible only by air. It would become the second busiest airport in Laos, though it appeared on no maps and was mentioned in no official documents. CIA operatives lived alongside Hmong soldiers, learning their language and customs while teaching them modern warfare. Air America pilots flew in supplies, weapons, and reinforcements under the cover of darkness. Meanwhile, an international treaty in 1962 attempted to form a fragile coalition of all Laotian factions and ordered all foreign military to leave. The Soviet Union stepped back. North Vietnam ignored the request. The United States moved its official military advisors to Thailand and continued covert support from there, operating through the CIA and Air America. By 1963, the coalition had collapsed and fighting resumed. The war in Laos was now firmly connected to the larger conflict in Vietnam. North Vietnam had established the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex logistics highway running through Laos into South Vietnam. The United States needed the Hmong to disrupt that trail and tie up North Vietnamese forces that would otherwise be fighting in South Vietnam. The secret war was escalating, and the Hmong were at the center of it. Initially, close air support for Hmong operations came from Thai and Laotian pilots flying up gunned T-28 trainers, propeller-driven aircraft from the 1950s loaded with machine guns and rockets. But as the war intensified, American pilots began flying Laotian-marked aircraft. They pretended to be contractors. They carried no identification. If they were shot down, the United States would deny they existed. Prince Suvarnabhumi, the neutralist leader who nominally led Laos, was concerned that bombing undermined his sovereignty. The United States pressured him to accept it anyway. By December 1964, the bombing campaign was formalized as Operation Barrel Roll. The escalation was dramatic. In 1964, there were 2 bombing missions per week. By 1966, there were 140 missions per week. The Plain of Jars, where Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces operated, became one of the most intensely bombed locations in human history. American forward air controllers, known as Ravens, arrived to coordinate strikes. These were pilots who flew small propeller aircraft over combat zones, marking targets with smoke rockets and calling in fighter bombers and B-52s. It was extraordinarily dangerous work. The Ravens flew slow, vulnerable aircraft at low altitude over enemy positions bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Despite the massive bombing campaign, it was officially secret. The American public knew nothing about it. Congress had not authorized it. Pilots who died in Laos were listed as killed in training accidents or lost in Vietnam. For the Hmong fighters on the ground, American air support became essential to survival. When Pathet Lao, or North Vietnamese forces, attacked Hmong positions, the defenders would call for airstrikes. Propeller-driven aircraft would arrive first, firing rockets and machine guns. Then came jet fighter bombers dropping napalm and high explosives. Finally, if the situation was desperate, B-52 bombers flying at 30,000 feet would carpet bomb entire grid squares. The bombing gave the Hmong a fighting chance, but it also meant that every battle depended on air support. If weather prevented flying, or if Air America couldn't resupply ammunition, Hmong positions would be overrun. By the mid-1960s, the war in Laos had settled into a predictable seasonal pattern. During the wet season, when heavy rains turned roads into impassable mud, the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces were stuck in place. This was when the Hmong, supplied by Air America helicopters, would go on the offensive. Using their knowledge of mountain trails and aided by American air support, Hmong units would attack Pathet Lao positions, capture territory, and push the enemy back. But when the dry season arrived and the roads dried out, the North Vietnamese army would counterattack with overwhelming force. Regular NVA units with artillery, mortars, and heavy weapons would advance along the roads, supported by Pathet Lao forces who knew the terrain. The Hmong would be forced to retreat back into the mountains. It was a war of attrition, and the Hmong were losing. The CIA tried to transform the Hmong into a more conventional offensive force, but internal disagreements among American operatives slowed progress. Some agents believed the Hmong should remain a guerrilla force, conducting hit-and-run operations and intelligence gathering. Others wanted to build a conventional army capable of holding territory. One particularly controversial operative, Anthony Poshepny, became notorious for his brutal methods. He collected ears from dead Pathet Lao soldiers, storing them in a large green reinforced cellophane bag. He would send them to CIA headquarters in Vientiane with his reports. "I'd tell my people to put them in," he later explained. "Sent them only once or twice, and then the office girls were sick for a week, putrid when they opened up the envelope." Ear collecting was soon discontinued, But the incident illustrated the dark reality of the secret war. This was no longer about defending Hmong villages from communist encroachment. It had become a brutal counterinsurgency campaign where success was measured in body counts and the rules of civilized warfare no longer applied. Despite American air support and CIA training, the Laotian government forces remained spectacularly corrupt and ineffective. Officers inflated troop numbers on paper to collect extra pay, pocketing the salaries of ghost soldiers who didn't exist. American equipment was routinely sold to Burmese opium cartels by Laotian commanders who had turned to drug running. The CIA knew about the drug trade and did little to stop it. Some historians have suggested the agency deliberately overlooked opium smuggling because they needed Laotian cooperation for the secret war. The opium often ended up reaching American troops in Vietnam, contributing to the drug epidemic among U.S. forces. By 1968, the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese were on the offensive again, seizing the town of Nam Bac and overrunning a secret American radar base at Pho Pha Tri. The radar base had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, an installation built on a remote mountaintop to track North Vietnamese aircraft and guide American bombers. Its loss was a significant intelligence failure. When President Lyndon Johnson announced an end to the bombing of North Vietnam in late 1968, he compensated by massively increasing bombing in Laos. B-52 bombers, which had previously been reserved for North Vietnam and South Vietnam, now pounded Laotian targets daily. The scale of the bombing was becoming impossible to hide. Journalists began asking questions. Congress started demanding answers. By 1969, the secret war wasn't so secret anymore. When Richard Nixon became president in 1969, he announced his intention to withdraw from Vietnam. That meant the Hmong had a limited window to win a decisive victory before American support disappeared. In late summer 1969, supported by massive American bombing, Hmong forces launched an offensive to capture the Plain of Jars. It was the most ambitious Hmong operation of the entire war. Thousands of fighters, backed by Thai artillery units and American air power, pushed the Pathet Lao out of their positions. For a few months, it looked like the Hmong might actually win. They controlled the strategically vital Plain of Jars. North Vietnamese supply lines were disrupted. Pathet Lao forces were retreating, but in February 1970, the North Vietnamese counterattacked with overwhelming force. Regular NVA divisions with tanks, artillery, and anti-aircraft weapons recaptured the Plain of Jars in a matter of weeks. The Hmong offensive had failed. Meanwhile, conventional warfare was draining Hmong manpower at an unsustainable rate. The Hmong population in Laos was small, perhaps 300,000 total. From that population, the CIA had recruited 30,000 fighters. Many of them were now dead. By 1971, General Vang Pao's secret army was breaking apart. They had suffered 3,300 killed in just 2 years. The average age of Hmong soldiers was dropping as teenagers were recruited to replace fallen fighters. Some units were now led by 15-year-old squad leaders commanding 13-year-old soldiers. Moa Thao, who had walked 3 days to join the secret army back in 1961, was now a veteran of 10 years of continuous combat. He had seen friends die. He had seen entire villages wiped out. He had seen the gradual erosion of Hmong society as the war consumed everything. "We helped the United States for 14 years, another Hmong soldier would later recall. Now they were leaving us without looking back. We didn't know when the communists came what they were going to do to us. Are they going to kill us? Or are they going to put us in re-education camps?" In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords officially ended American involvement in the Vietnam War. The agreement included provisions for Laos. All foreign forces were supposed to withdraw, and a new coalition government, including the Pathet Lao, would take power. For the Hmong, it was a death sentence. American air support ended immediately. CIA operatives packed up and left. Air America stopped flying. The Hmong secret army, which had depended entirely on American supplies and air power, was suddenly on its own. The Pathet Lao didn't stop fighting. Neither did North Vietnamese forces. They continued to attack Hmong villages, now defenseless, without American support. By 1975, the Pathet Lao dominated the new coalition government. They abolished the monarchy and installed Suphanuvong as Prime Minister of the Lao People's Democratic Republic. It was mostly a non-violent takeover in the lowlands, but in the mountains, the new government continued military operations against the Hmong. 40,000 Laotians were sent to re-education camps. The Hmong were specifically targeted. Villages were destroyed. Leaders were arrested. The government that the Hmong had fought against for 14 years was now hunting them systematically. General Vang Pao escaped to Thailand and eventually to the United States, but most Hmong fighters had no way out. They fled into the jungle, trying to evade Pathet Lao patrols. Some continued fighting a hopeless guerrilla war for years. 50,000 Hmong eventually escaped Laos, most of them settling in the United States. They arrived as refugees from a war most Americans didn't know had happened. They carried no official recognition for their service. The CIA classified or destroyed most records of the secret war. American pilots who had died in Laos were buried with cover stories about training accidents. The Hmong refugees tried to explain where they came from and why they had fought. But how do you explain a secret war? How do you describe fighting for 14 years for a country that denies you ever existed? The numbers tell part of the story. Throughout the entire war, the United States dropped 2.75 million tons of bombs on Laos, roughly the same amount dropped on all of Europe during World War II. For context, that's about one plane load of bombs every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, for 9 years straight. Up to 1/3 of those bombs failed to explode. Today, more than 40 years after the war ended, unexploded ordnance remains a significant threat in Laos. Children find cluster bomblets while playing. Farmers hit buried bombs while plowing fields. The Lao government estimates it will take another 100 years to clear all the unexploded ordnance. The Laotian Civil War killed up to 200,000 Lao civilians and military personnel, roughly 10% of the pre-war population. The Hmong lost 30,000 fighters killed, plus an unknown number of civilians. 728 Americans died, mostly pilots and CIA personnel, though the true number may be higher given the classified nature of the war. 250,000 Laotians became refugees. The Hmong diaspora now numbers over 300,000 in the United States alone, with significant populations in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and California. They have built successful communities, started businesses, sent their children to college, but they carry with them the memory of a war their adopted country still struggles to acknowledge. In 1997, the CIA finally dedicated a memorial at its headquarters in Langley, Virginia, honoring the Hmong soldiers who fought in Laos. It was a small recognition, decades late, but it meant something to the refugees who attended the ceremony. Mua Thao, who had walked 3 days through the jungle in 1961 to join the secret army, eventually made it to America. He settled in California, learned English, worked in a factory. He never talked much about the war. What was there to say? He had fought for 14 years in a war that officially didn't exist. He had lost friends, family, his homeland, and in the end he had been abandoned. But he had survived. That was something. The secret war in Laos should have taught American policymakers important lessons about the limits of military power, the costs of covert operations, and the dangers of arming proxy forces without long-term commitment. It didn't. The pattern repeated itself in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the CIA armed and trained Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet Union and then walked away when the Soviets withdrew. Many of those fighters eventually formed Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. It repeated again in Syria, when the United States armed rebel groups against the Assad government and then struggled to control what those groups did loaded with American weapons. The fundamental problem remains the same. It's easy to start a war by arming local forces. It's much harder to end one. And when you abandon your allies after promising to support them, you create lasting resentment and future enemies. The Hmong were lucky in one respect. They didn't turn against the United States despite being abandoned. The Hmong refugees who came to America have largely become proud Americans, serving in the U.S. military at rates higher than the general population. Their children have succeeded in education and business. They have contributed to American society in countless ways. But they remember the promises made and broken. They remember the secret war that America still doesn't fully acknowledge. They remember fighting for 14 years for a country that wouldn't admit they existed. In the mountains of Laos, there are no memorials to the Hmong soldiers who died in the secret war. No monuments, no plaques, nothing but unmarked graves scattered across the highlands, slowly being reclaimed by jungle. The Plain of Jars, once the most intensely bombed location in history, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site known for its mysterious ancient stone jars. Tourists visit to see archaeological wonders. Few know that the same fields were carpet-bombed for 9 years straight, that Hmong soldiers died there by the thousands, that unexploded cluster bombs still lurk beneath the grass. Long Tieng, the secret base that was once the second busiest airport in Laos, is abandoned now. The runways are cracked and overgrown. The buildings are ruins. Nature is slowly erasing all evidence that 30,000 Hmong fighters trained there, that CIA operatives lived there, that Air America pilots flew in and out around the clock for over a decade. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which the United States spent billions trying to destroy, is now a tourist attraction. Adventurous travelers ride motorcycles along the old supply routes, marveling at the engineering that allowed North Vietnam to move armies through jungle and mountains despite relentless American bombing. History has moved on. The secret war is mostly forgotten, filed away as a Cold War footnote, a minor side theater in the larger Vietnam conflict. But for the Hmong who fought in it, the war never ended. They carried it with them to America. They passed down the stories to their children and grandchildren. They remember the promises made by CIA operatives who assured them America would never abandon its allies. They remember Mua Thao walking 3 days through the jungle to join an army that didn't officially exist. They remember 3 days of weapons training before being sent into combat against an enemy that had been fighting for decades. They remember American bombs falling like rain, turning mountains into moonscapes, killing Pathet Lao soldiers and Hmong villagers alike. They remember winning battles in the wet season and losing them in the dry season, year after year, until the pattern became inevitable. They remember the day American air support stopped coming, the day the CIA operatives left, the day they realized they had been abandoned. And they remember fleeing through the jungle one final time, not to a training base or a secret airfield, but to Thailand, to refugee camps, to an uncertain future in a country that denied their war ever happened. The secret war in Laos was one of the longest and most intensive covert operations in American history. It cost billions of dollars, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. North Vietnam continued using the Ho Chi Minh Trail throughout the war. The Pathet Lao eventually took control of Laos. The Hmong were left to face the consequences alone. It was a war fought in the shadows, denied by the government that sponsored it, forgotten by the public that funded it, and remembered only by the people who died in it. The secret army wasn't so secret after all. The Hmong paid the price for America's Cold War ambitions, and when the check came due, America wasn't there to pay it. That's the real story of the secret war in Laos, not the tactical operations or the bombing statistics or the geopolitical Strategies. It's the story of 30,000 Hmong fighters who believed American promises, who fought for 14 years in a war that didn't officially exist, and who were abandoned when that war finally ended. Their service deserves to be remembered. Their sacrifice deserves to be acknowledged. And their story deserves to be told, even if it reveals uncomfortable truths about American foreign policy and the human cost of covert operations. The secret war in Laos should never have been secret. Wars always have consequences, and those consequences don't disappear just because you classify them.